Before we go any further, we'll do a refresh on why ethical storytelling matters. And I like using this quote by Erica and Bettina. It says ethical stories lift up the inherent resourcefulness and the power of individuals forced to grapple with those systemic inequalities. And I believe this is a quote that will resonate with everyone in the room today, because the various work that we do really also seeks to address systemic inequalities or is solving challenges and coming with solutions that are aimed at addressing systemic inequalities. There are five main frames through which most stories about Africa are told. I think it's still loading. There are five main frames through which most stories about Africa are told. The frames are corruption, poverty, disease, poor leadership, and conflict. And a result of these frames in all these stories, they result in a narrative that says Africa is broken and dependent, and that Africans lack the agency to change their circumstances, to change communities, to change societies, but to also even change their own circumstances directly. My internet is being a bit slow today. Do forgive me, please, everyone. Narratives matter because they are not just a story. A story that is stereotypically framed is not just a story. It is part of a collection of stories that influence and shape perceptions. And those perceptions have implications. They impact on aid and donor relations. They impact on business and investment to such an extent that Africa is actually estimated to pay close to 4 billion USD in inflated interest rates compared to other countries outside of the continent that have the same risk profile. Narratives impact how the world sees Africa, and most importantly, they impact how Africans see themselves and how we see our continent. In case some of you haven't had a moment to engage with Africa No Filter, we are an advocacy organization on a mission to shift outdated perceptions about Africa by supporting the development of stories that reflect Africa's progress, opportunity, and innovation. Bear this in mind. Remember, I mentioned the five frames of poverty, poor leadership, disease, corruption, and conflict, which I believe many of us are very familiar with. And then our work as Africa No Filter is to shift the stories, the framing, and the mindsets about Africa to show that Africa is a continent that has limitless progress, opportunity, and innovation. And this is where ethical storytelling matters, particularly to everyone who's gathered in this room today because of the areas of focus that we work in and the organizations that we represent. Storytelling is the most powerful way for donor and non-governmental organizations to convey their work. We use stories because they allow audiences to connect intellectually and emotionally. However, much of the storytelling about development work in Africa tends to perpetuate harmful and stereotypical narratives. And these harmful stereotypical narratives are not necessarily always intentional. It is not as if communicators and storytellers go out of their way to create these stereotypical narratives. There's a basis for them. Previously, it used to be that if you wanted to tug at heartstrings to get people to perhaps donate to a cause, you'd put a starving African child, and that used to work. Sadness, that brokenness used to serve a specific purpose, ethical or not. It was what it was, but thankfully the world has changed and we've had much deeper conversations as individuals, but also collectively as humanity. Ethical storytelling therefore means adopting new approach that consciously tries to move away from harmful and stereotypical narratives. So essentially, ethical storytelling starts with a storyteller, a communicator, a content creator, aware that the way in which we are inherently trained and the in which we trained to tell African stories inherently tends to focus more on stereotypes than anything else. For example, if anyone here went to journalism school, you know that on the first day, they tell you if it bleeds, it leads. And that becomes what you seek to do as someone telling African stories. If you want a front page, it better be a dying, starving African. Otherwise, you'll be somewhere page 10, page 20. What does unethical storytelling look like? Unethical storytelling are stories that blur the distinctions between individual countries so that they fit into a single frame of poverty and suffering. Or in other words, they're stories that reduce Africa, 55 countries, into one singular entity, as if it is a country, not a continent. These are stories that focus on individual or community deficits rather than their agency. So these are stories that focus on what communities and individuals lack, not what they have that is a solution. It also it looks like the people or local organizations that are working to tackle the problem lack sufficient voices in the stories. So again, this is when, and I think this is something we see a lot. I refer to journalism because that was my primary training, and I tend to see the world more through the lens of being a trained journalist. This is where you see stories of a story set in Kenya, a story set in Somalia, set in South Africa, but the experts are based in Oxford, they're based in New York, they're not based in Nairobi, they are not the people whose stories, whose journey is being told. Unethical storytelling also means that narratives tend to imply that only development organization can solve the problems depicted in the story. So it casts communities and individuals as helpless and development organizations as saviors who come in and swoop in with their solution. And thanks to their intervention, everything changed. Here, I'd like us to pause and think about what unethical storytelling, about the danger of unethical storytelling. We'll come back to it during Q&A, but do think about your work directly, the work that you do in your organization, your storytelling that you do for your organization, and then juxtapose it around these developments, right? While Africa continues to be defined by stereotypical frames, and and consequently, Africa No Filter is calling for the stories of Africa to be told through progress, opportunity, and innovation. Some people often ask, why should we? Isn't the reality that the continent is poor, broken, and so on? But we're also seeing that there has been a change in the narrative of the continent. More recently, for example, Africa has been highlighted as an emerging destination for investment with high GDP growth rates, even with the negative impact that COVID-19 had on countries and economies. The continent is seeing an increase in peaceful elections and stability. And if anyone raised their eyebrows at saying an increase in peaceful elections and stability, remember 55 countries, 4 coups d'etats in 4 countries do not mean a continent of 55 is unstable. It means a continent of 55 has 4 countries that experience political turmoil. There has been a decrease in poverty and a spread of technology. As a result, the call to action then becomes, and this is our call to action to everyone here, that as storytellers, as communicators, we need to ensure that these positive stories break through in the work that we do, in the stories that we tell about the work that we do, and that when we represent Africa, we do so with nuance and context that reflects the dynamism of the continent versus defaulting into harmful and stereotypical narratives. My favorite part of the presentation. What does ethical storytelling look like? It is stories that highlight assets, that show capability, and that show innovation. They show opportunity, creativity, they celebrate agency. There are stories that highlight collaboration. There are stories that position African and African organizations, this includes African experts in the storytelling and reporting, as a central role in the story. So they are not being othered, they are the drivers of the story, the architect of the story. Ethical stories do not shy away from discussing problems, but they provide context, nuance, and specific details, such as statistics and names of places. Statistics is very important. Many of us here, and I think especially myself, because I used to work for Global Citizen, and our work was around advocating to end global poverty. We used to have a lot of statistics because I believed they made my story better. So in Bujumbura, where less than half of the population lives on less than $2 a day, and that used to feel like I'm adding depth. I'm showing that the level of suffering and deficiency. But then as I grew in my storytelling, as I got exposed to tools like ethical storytelling, I got to understand that that in itself lacks nuance because it often tends to reduce. It's a statistic that cuts across all of Africa, used to cut across all of Africa, and often unpacked. What does it mean when we say people live on $2 a day? Maybe they do, maybe they do not. But what does the data mean, and how does it actually apply to the story that we're telling, versus defaulting into statistics that are just thrown in there to generally boost a point that one is trying to frame in their story. Ethical stories do not rely on pity to engage audiences. And rather than treating Africa as one country, they treat Africa as a continent, and they specify the details and places of absolutely everything. An example of why this matters, for example, is that I know so much about America just from pop culture. I know that there's Wisconsin, I know that there's Arkansas and Arkansas, and they're not even pronounced the same. But that's because the stories that Americans tell about America are really nuanced, are really detailed, are really specific. They do not just apply they do not just apply one brush stroke to everything. So that's always important to mention. You may be working on a project in Nigeria, but is it in Nigeria, Lagos, Abuja? Is it in Benin Republic? Where is it? It is not just Nigeria. It is a specific place in Nigeria. This is the part where we now talk about how to put ethical storytelling into practice. We suggest that you do so in 8 steps, and all these 8 steps are clear, simple, and actionable. And this is very important, if nothing else, from this presentation. Take away these 8 steps, because what they allow us to do is you're then able to immediately reframe how you tell your stories. You are able to identify where your storytelling for your organization needs to be reframed so that it fits in with the mode of ethical storytelling, without it being a change in how you work, without it being a need to make new financial and even talent resources available. It is really about framing, planning, and understanding execution that amounts to ethical storytelling. The first one is you need to challenge unequal power relations in our storytelling. Very often, donor relations by nature tend to be skewed towards the person who's giving the money, right? I believe that generally that's how the world works. That's not how individuals and organizations might work, but whoever controls the purse, whoever has the string, has power, has more power. So they are more able to drive the agenda. They're more able to be the ones who approve everything. That in itself is not a bad thing, but it's important to know that automatically when you come in as a funder, when you come in as a donor, you do not have, you're not on an equal power footing with a community, with people that you work with, and being conscious of that helps you understand then inherently this is not a relationship of equals. And not being a relationship of equals doesn't mean that it's a relationship that it doesn't mean that it's a relationship that abuses. It doesn't mean that it's a relationship that diminishes other people. It just means being acutely aware that the power balance is not the same. Step 2, ensuring respectful engagements. This is particularly important in I think it's very important everywhere globally, but it's particularly important in the global south, where notions of respect are very cultural, they're very ingrained in people, and they come front and center. So, for example, greetings are very, very, very important across the continent. You have to say hello, how are you doing, how are you, and mean it. I come from Pretoria. If you want to do anything in Pretoria, if you do not greet a person, people just shut up. They, in fact, do not engage you at all. They just go. And then if you ask again, they say, "Did I wake up with you? Then why didn't you greet?" And that in itself makes the engagement, it compromises the nature of the engagement. So it's very important to really be mindful of what respect looks like to the people that you're interacting with, and what does respectful engagement looks like to them. If you are working in a Muslim community, for example, and you are required that you cover yourself, that's what that's what meaningful and respectful engagement looks like in that community. If you are working in particular local context, cultural context, where, for example, in a space, you might find that women are not given access to a particular part of a space. As a feminist, that will always really get to me. It will frustrate me. But I'm there not in my personal capacity. I'm there capturing a story of a people and an organization. Therefore, I need to mind my own feelings first so that I show respect. You need to tackle implicit bias in the hiring process as organizations. And I think this one is something that oftentimes becomes easy to not pay attention to. We know how we all like to hire. We ideally want people who have much more experience, want people who are very, very well versed with the work that they're about to do, and people who are closer to the organization. But then that can sometimes mean that organizations, particularly those not based in the global south, will then hire teams of people who are based exclusively in the global north. And that creates a bit of a geographical imbalance, because the work itself is not just located within the global north, it is within the global north and the global south. So it's very important to be aware of how hiring processes can compromise storytelling, or how they can boost storytelling, so that your messaging and framing lends itself towards ethical storytelling. And then step 4 is addressing implicit bias in storytelling. Everyone has their own bias. Whatever your bias may be, it's very important that you address it firstly as an individual, but then also any organizational bias that you may have, again, so that when you go to the world, when you go to tell the stories, when you meet communities, you are not there already with a checkbox written of things that you presume will happen, and you are just there to confirm and tick 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 and be like, right, great, see, story as I predicted it would go. It's very important to address bias. And then step 5 is using ethical guidelines and understanding informed consent. Ethical guidelines are everything that I've explained so far, but really, really understanding informed consent. People must be able to consent to participating in the project at whatever level, and they need to understand it in a language that they are more fluent in, that they understand better than English, and they need to understand exactly what that content will be used like. So, for example, if I'm going to interview Carol Parsons, I have to say to her, Carol, this story is going to be used in a funders report. We're going to create a video. We're going to do social media amplification across 5 platforms. We're going to use it in our media newsletter, in our community newsletter, and it is going to be evergreen content, so that there is never a moment when a person agrees to a story, but then their image, their story, their life experience, their lived experience is used beyond what they signed up for. the way to ensure that that happens is to fully explain consent to people. And part of that is understanding that language can sometimes compromise communication and ability to understand, because English is not everyone's first language. It's not even a national language in some countries. So it's very important to then understand that when it comes to consent, it includes not being limited to the language that the organization works in. And then number 6 is understanding the local context. And this really means, again, 55 countries, more than 2,000 languages, more than thousands of ethnic identities, and so on. So the context is never going to look the same in Nkandla, KwaZulu-Natal as it is going to be in, I'm trying to think quickly of in Kumasi, Ghana. It's not going to be the same. So even if an organization is working in both locations, when you go to work in those spaces, you have to remember that local context comes first. And the local context also speaks to issues of respect. It speaks to issues of addressing bias. It also speaks to issues of making sure that when you hire and work with staff, you have factored in the local context. And then investing time in projects. I think this is very important. Ethical storytelling essentially needs time, right? If you're going to tell stories ethically, you need time for your projects, because you need to go and interrogate every single step. If we need to understand local consent, I mean, sorry, if we, let's say with the example of understanding informed consent and saying that it has to bear in mind that it may not necessarily be in the organizational language. If you have not invested time and you've given yourself a day to just show up and work on a project, you have not done any outreach prior, there hasn't been any planning, it is going to be hard for an organization, for a storyteller to really be fully invested in every step, in all the 8 steps of ethical storytelling, because you're just there very quickly, you chasing a deadline, you are time bound, and the work must be done ASAP, which is also legitimate. But better planning obviously means that you're able to look at exactly what's needed. You're able to see if there's any opportunity for collaborating with a local storyteller. You're able to find local experts, and invest in finding local experts, because I know that sometimes it's just not always easy to find subject matter experts, especially for niche topics and niche work. So it's not you don't just always go on Google and a name, an organization, an email pops out. Sometimes you really have to keep digging until you find what you're looking for. It enriches the story, but it becomes something we sacrifice if we have not invested in time to plan projects and in time to plan and interrogate every step of what we are producing, how we are producing it, and why we are producing it. Step 8 is investing in your people as an organization. Excuse me, you need to invest in people. People need to have skills to do the work they're doing. They need to have the resources. They need to be empowered to be able to tell the story. So, for example, investing in staff, in your people as part of ethical storytelling can look like making sure that if your work that you're reporting on is around conflict and the aftermath of conflict or trauma, is then understanding that that has an effect on your people's mental health, and they need to come back and be able to, the organization needs to be able to provide some way to support people mentally, so that the work itself doesn't then traumatize them, even though it exposes them to trauma. So getting ethical storytelling right means creating better, more authentic stories that connect people of different backgrounds and disrupt inequitable power relations, especially around race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, class, and so on. Representing lived experiences more accurately, encouraging mutual respect, and preserving the dignity of those whose stories or whose story or whose stories are being told. How do we overcome unethical storytelling? It's a multi-pronged approach at ANF, right? So the first step that we always say is the course ethical storytelling, which I've just taken you through now in a nutshell, is very important because it essentially helps you unpack the foundation of what better storytelling and what better stories look like. Secondly, it is being able to deploy AI and tech solutions that Africa No Filter has, like the Africa Bias Buster, that after you have produced your content, you submit it through the platform and it scans it for context, for nuance. It gives you a score, it gives you suggestions, it tells you where you can improve, how you can refrain. So every tool that we have is not necessarily around changing the work that you do or having to make more resources available, both financially and human resources, but essentially doing what we've always done differently. And some of our storytelling tools are Why Change the Way We Write About Africa. We have the elections guidebook that's aimed at helping journalists change how they tell African stories of African elections. And we now also have this course, the ethical storytelling course, that is free and available for anyone to register and study self-paced. So I hope you'll be able to do that, or that you'll be inspired to register for the course as well. Reflections and sharing. This is where I stop talking, my favorite part, and everyone else contributes their perspective. The first one is I'd like us to reflect on your journey to ethical storytelling. If two or three people can tell us why they're particularly interested in wanting to center ethical storytelling in their work, please. Anyone can volunteer. I'm very shy to call out people. Carol, it has to be you because I can see your name on my screen and I can't see everyone else.
Okay, thank you. What was our journey to ethical storytelling? We actually use our partners, SUP Community Initiatives Africa, to collect the stories, but we have given them a few pointers as to what content might be in the story, because they didn't have any idea of what does it mean by gaining a story, what is it. So we had to give them a few pointers, but we also listened to them. And we had to take in the safety of the person as well, and also the area, to find out what is that area, is there more poverty in that area, are women more abused in that area, that overall picture. But our partners had the answers to that, we didn't.
Okay.
And so we've had to rely a lot on them.
Great.
And I suppose also the challenges were they were taking photos for us, but with people just stood around, and it was just pointing them that it's lovely if there's some action in the actual photos, just giving them little pointers that we might know about, but then very much listening to them.
Yes. So thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, there's a lot of points that you touched on, but what really stood out for me was the investment in people. I kept on hearing how your organization invests in people, and the partners you work, the storytellers you work with are not just expected to go there and produce a story. They are seen as co-creators, co-curators of the story itself, and their experiences themselves are central to how the story is reported. Kevin, can you tell us about some of the challenges that you may perhaps have seen along the way in engaging with ethical storytelling? Kevin? Can anyone hear me? Oh,
Yes.
great. Maybe maybe Orife, you can. Oh, Peter, you're about to say something. Go ahead.
Oh, hi. Good morning, everyone. I must say it's a
Mm.
very impressive presentation and so helpful. So, can I just check that we'll be able to get a copy of the slides and a recording of this presentation afterwards?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So, I'm a trustee with a charity called Tools for Self-Reliance Cymru. We're based in Crickhowell, and we send tools and sewing machines to northern Tanzania, and
Mm.
we provide training and certification and workshop facilities there. And back in Wales, where we're based, a lot of our social media, etc., has had to be very much focused about fundraising and the events we attend and the festivals we attend to raise
Mm.
funds for the shipping, etc. And we haven't been doing enough about telling the stories that we do in Tanzania.
Mm.
And so we're trying to address that and having a bit of a push on a focus on the work in Tanzania, because we've got some very good feedback from some of our
Mm.
friends in Tanzania that we've managed to support. And so I'm just trying to learn really how to do this in a way that's effective, impactful, and respectful, and
Mm.
helps us to tell our story really, because there's a
Mm.
lot of it's a lot of success behind the work we do, but there's lots still to do as well. So that's where I'm coming from. So I'm finding this very helpful.
No, no, it is helpful. Thank you so much. I think a very great challenge to have, honestly, is imagining how you're
Yeah.
going to tell a story, because it means you can start building
Yeah.
towards telling that story. And in this instance, impact storytelling tends to really be much more convincing than, because it shows assets versus deficit. So I hope that's something you will remember as you go, as you and your organization really think about how you're going to tell the stories of the great work that you do, so that the stories you tell show the people being empowered, and the positive effect of the work that
Yes.
has been done, versus the negative social circumstances that led to the work.
Yeah. Can I just add that we're quite a small charity.
Mm.
We sort of punch above our weight, really. We've been quite successful for a small charity, but we can't afford to hire in professionals to help us with social media and all. It's all done. I do most of it. It's all done in-house, actually. So it's trying
Mm.
to get that balance right between, because I see how effective even your slide deck is compared to our slide deck, and it just seems like, there's a lot to do.
Yeah, don't worry, we'll all get there. And I think with stories and money, no one has a budget these days. It's an
No.
actual economic reality. Absolutely no
Yeah.
one has a budget. So we've all had to dig deep. We've all had tried to spread ourselves thin. I was joking with my boss that, one person essentially fulfills 5 roles in an organization now.
Yeah.
So good luck with that.
Thank you. And we'd be able to contact yourself or somebody like yourself if we needed any further guidance about anything in particular.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I actually also volunteer for organizations.
Right.
So if I can't do anything day to day, I help with co-creation of strategy and so on.
Yeah. Oh, are you based in Cardiff, Loretto?
No, I'm based in Johannesburg.
Oh, okay. So okay.
Yeah.
So
Peter,
coming to Wales
yeah.
to do a talk would be a bit of a stretch then.
Yes, we'll talk on
Yes.
email. I'm gonna drop my email in the chat box for
Thank you.
everyone. Um, and I think I'd like to hear what some
We have
best
some
practice.
we have some hands up as well.
Okay.
Angela Gorman hands are up and Linda Campbell. So maybe Angela, please, could you go first?
Yes. Please speak. Oh, great. Yes. Thank you so much. Linda and Angela, please go ahead.
Okay. Who's first?
Angela,
Linda.
Okay.
Angela's hand up. Oh.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. I'm sorry. Angela first then.
Okay, thank you. Until last Sunday, I was the CEO of a maternal health charity called Life for African Mothers. We've had to close down completely after 21 years. But I've traveled extensively in Africa and around the country here presenting the charity and facts behind maternal mortality. And one of the myths, and I always talk about it here as well as in Africa, is the fact that a lot of people still think that it's the mother who determines whether a baby is a boy or a girl. And in the main, it doesn't really present a problem here. But in many communities and cultures, it can put huge pressure on women to continue having babies until they produce boys. And I remember particularly one event when I traveled to Somaliland, and at the invitation of the local people, we did an event, and I was asked to speak about maternal mortality, and about a third of the audience were men, and 2/3 of the audience were women, and there were a few children as well. So I asked directly of the audience, are you aware that it's the father of a baby who determines whether it's a boy or a girl? And I was faced with a sea of blank faces. And so I looked at the men who sat all together. I think they were a bit nervous of what I was going to be talking about. And I looked at them and said, are you aware that it is you who determine whether a baby is a boy or a girl, not the mother? And they mostly shook their heads. And so I explained in graphic detail how a baby becomes a boy or a girl. And they were clearly very uncomfortable with that conversation, with me giving them that information. And at the end, I said, do you believe what I'm telling you? And they said yes. So now, do you understand why it is so unfair that women are blamed and often their lives are put at risk? The pressure on them to continue having lots of babies in order to have boys, when in fact it's down to the dads. And that was fine. It was no problem. But when I came back, a number of the local ladies, and I told them about it, said, you can't talk to people like that, about that. You can't talk to men particularly. And I said, but if people don't know, how are we ever going to change the narrative around maternal mortality and women being put at risk? You can't shy away from these things. And so the dilemma really is about whether you risk offending people by telling them what you know is scientifically correct, or do you say nothing? And as I said, people in this country don't know. There are a lot of people who don't know that it's the father. So I'm not picking out the fact when I go to Africa, I say it everywhere. But I know within some cultures it is difficult, but we can't ignore what we know to be scientifically true to save people's feelings when women's lives are being put at risk. So I wondered what you thought of that scenario. It's not a scenario, it's an actual event.
Yes, that is quite interesting in the sense that you right in saying you can't be silent, because it is a scientific fact, right? And it is in fact part of the work that you do. So I wonder how that is something that could have meaningfully been engaged culturally, as the woman you spoke to later expressed. It's not a conversation that necessarily happens between men and women, I guess, because it's part of the same thing. Anything that has to do with reproduction and women's bodies usually tends to be taboo as a discussion, even amongst women sometimes. But I think when you're speaking, I thought of there's a project in Senegal. It's called the School for Husbands, and they essentially are tackling all types of issues that affect women: gender-based violence, maternal health, birth control, family planning, all those things. The school are the school is called the School for Husbands. I think it's not the official name. They essentially bring men together as a way to communicate to men about these issues. But that's just one example of what can possibly happen to make a conversation happen, right? In some cases, it could be that you need to first get buy-in from a leader, a community leader or two, who then facilitates that conversation to happen in a way that the locals feel that it followed their cultural protocol, even if it's not a conversation they want to have anyway. But I really, in this instance, it really sounds like the lady was just uncomfortable because it's not a conversation that she herself would be very free and bold to have with men, but it feels like a necessary conversation. It would have been a different story if after you have spoken, there was, everyone is mad and feels disrespected and they're throwing things around and things are falling apart because how dare you come in here and say that, So I think that's really, really different. It wasn't unethical. It's a very specific, very, very specific and very, very challenging cultural context because they exist
Yeah.
in their thousands across the continent,
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Linda, can you please say your question?
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. It's new headphones. Thank you so much for this. This was really, really interesting. I work in academia. I'm based at a university. And so although the kind of storytelling that we do is quite different, it's, scientific publications and so on, and communication with policymakers around the results of studies that we do, it's still a narrative, it's still a story that we're telling even in scientific writing. And a lot of the work that I do is based in various countries in Africa as well as in Europe. And the kind of narratives that we write about are certainly very important to consider and to make sure that we do get it right. In recent projects, we've been trying to reflect better on the kind of power relations, for example, that we have with local researchers, because certainly something that Western universities are very good at doing is coming in, taking data, then going back to their own institutions and publishing it with very little reference to local teams. So on a recent project that we worked on in Burkina Faso and DRC was around antimicrobial resistance. And we sat with the local teams, the local researchers, and said, okay, what do you want to get out of this particular study? And the local researchers all said unequivocally, we want the opportunity to publish because we're very rarely given that. The Western universities usually leave, take the data and publish themselves about us. And so we said, absolutely, okay. So we ran a 2-week workshop on how to write a scientific article. And then we also made sure that within the consortium of research groups, we gave the African researchers the first opportunity to choose what topics they wanted to address. And the rest of us could only sort of say what we would like to research on after they had chosen. And we've been mentoring those young researchers to come, and the first one has just published their article, and the second one is just now in review under a journal, which is really, really exciting. But yes, there's still a long way that the scientific community has to go in order to tackle a lot of the power relations that exist between Western research institutions and research institutions based on the continent. So yes, today was really useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Linda. I think Dina Owen's hands were up, then Cecilia, then Isra Mohammed.
Hello, Loretto. Thank you. You've given us a lot of food for thought. I run a very small charity that works in Zambia, helping poor school children in a rural area. And really, it's I do presentations to groups in Wales. It's hard to know how much poverty to show, because I did a presentation recently, and I ended the presentation with a photo of school children looking very nice, well-fed, happy, smiling in their uniforms, waving fruit they'd grown in the garden. And people said, well, you don't need money because, you know, they look as good as school children in the UK. Yes, they are poor, but we can make a difference. What would you say about getting the balance right?
Yeah, I think, you know, that's such an interesting dilemma, because that obviously the nature of charity and giving and philanthropy and aid has changed, right? But really, when you think about charity, certainly in how I have experienced it in my life as a global concept, or as a global concept, was in 95 when Ethiopia had that famine. Remember the era of We Are the World, Bob Geldof's music festivals and whatnot. And they did something great, which was let's raise funds for poverty alleviation. But the pictures they used were of starving children, and that became a way in which that became the language of charity and wanting to get money from individuals. You have to target their heartstrings. You have to make them cry. You have to show dying, starving children, really. But I feel that that's something that just unfortunately needs a mindset change. And for your charity, you have to start thinking about messaging. So how are you taking your day-to-day messaging, whether it's in your reports, whether it's in however way you communicate, right? But what are you doing that can ladder up to a mind shift change in the people that you're appealing to? Because you're caught between a rock and a hard place. Stories, a person can be poor and happy. You know, they can be poor but well fed still, right? There's so much more. But the mindset that people associate with Africa is not necessarily one of optimism. It's not necessarily one of joy, of health, particularly when it's in a giving context and when it's to alleviate poverty. So I think you need to consider how you can do mind shift change through your messaging, so that they get to understand why you cannot use images, for example, that they would prefer to see. I think it's very important for everyone involved to always understand that, you know, for us, it may be a project, it may be a story, it may be I'm just doing support, and all these things matter. But this is also a work of dignity, and it's about people's dignity. And every human being still deserves that dignity, no matter how impoverished they are, no matter how much they may need from you, and no matter how much you give to them. The question of human dignity is not one that really is open for that much debate. And it's something that organizations are also engaging with and also trying to grapple with. I mean, was it last month? Last month, Comic Relief said that they're no longer going to use children at all in their marketing, in their communication, in when they go out and seek donations. And children have been such a big part of how they appeal to people for support, right? Because who doesn't want to, you know, make a child's life better? But look, that's where we find ourselves now. Sometimes you have to lead, the audience follows. Sometimes the audience follow, the audience leads, the organization follows. In this case, you are leading and helped your audience follow by seeing how your day-to-day day-to-day messaging creates their own mind shift change around how they understand the work that you do.
Thank you, Laura. So, we have Cecilia, Ezra, and Valerie and Jim, but we have to be quick. We have 5 more minutes. And would it be okay if I launch the poll while everyone is asking the question before we round up?
Yes.
Thank you. So, Cecilia, could you go first, then Ezra could go ahead. And Kat as well. Cecilia? Okay, maybe Ezra, go on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Brilliant session. So thank you so much for reflections, and I loved your presentation slides, how colorful they are. So thank you for that. And the stories deliver more, they're more impactful than what we write or the graphs that we might want to share in different contexts. So I think I just would like to highlight on the challenges and like to mention one challenge, the authenticity and the influence of external narratives, the Western narratives, the Africans, generalizing Africans here, because I know so many of them, they are excellent storytellers. And I'm from Sudan, originally from Sudan. I'm currently a member of Hub Camry Africa and chair of Global Health Partnerships Camry. But back in the days when I was a child, I remember my grandmother used to tell me fascinating stories, full of wisdom, but she wasn't educated. So I'm just thinking here loudly how we can preserve that African authenticity of storytelling without the Western influence, and especially now with the digital use across the world, see most of the stories are almost the same. How we can preserve that and how we can link the older generation with the newer generation in order to deliver the African stories based on the African traditions and the African way of storytelling. I think this is the main reflection from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ezra. That's so interesting because I think imagine you introducing an element of what if creative writing becomes part of ethical storytelling and part of how organizations tell their stories. Because in creative storytelling, the rules are not rigid, it's not like a fundus report. You can record impact story through oral histories, the same way your grandmother would tell them. If you apply it through the lens of creative storytelling, it means you can introduce that tradition to how you tell that impact story. And also, again, also recognizing that how stories are told it's not necessarily going to be in a Western way only, or that Western / rigorous academic training, right, an application of what ultimately knowledge that matters is. It doesn't have to end there. And I think the thing I think what's even more interesting right now is we're all very fortunate that we're having these conversations and these challenges and grappling with this issue at a time when the world can contain these conversations. We are benefiting from many global movements like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, and so on. Fees must fall, conversations around decolonial work, shifting global centers of power, and so on. So because of that, we find that even though there are challenges, even though there are so many issues to grapple with and unpack, there's equally also so many opportunities to reimagine how we work, and also so many possibilities. One of the things that I'm absolutely fascinated with at the moment is for communications is hope-based communication. So how do you tell the story of your organization and your impact through a lens of hope, right, to inspire hope? And then also solutions journalism, which essentially says you unpack the problem, but how you unpack it is you start with the solution that was implemented. So the solution and getting to the solution becomes the most important part of the story. The problem you are addressing becomes the context to what we are now reading through this solution framed narrative.
Thank you. Can we have Jane, then Valerie, then Kat, then maybe Laura to summarize the answers?
I just wanted, I work for Hands Around the World, a very small charity, and find this, completely fascinating like everybody else. And we deal with various countries within Africa. I think I'm the social media person, and I've been to lots of different presentations to see how to represent the various voices that we work with. And I think the one thing that just always sticks with me, because I'm talking about a lot of children's stories, is I have children, and would I be happy with somebody writing what I've written about somebody else if it were my child? Would I be happy if it was my mother? Would I be happy with my aunties or uncles or grandparents reading this? And I think if you are, a lot of the time then your message is nearly always going to be fairly correct in representing the people in an equitable and positive way. That was all I was going to add.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, yes.
Kat?
Hiya. So I just wanted to go back. Thank you very much, Loretta, for the presentation. It's fantastic, really, really interesting, and like lots to think about and take away. You mentioned in your presentation about an assessment and feedback tool that Africa No Filter has. Did I understand that right? How would I use
Yes.
it?
Oh, sorry. There's it's an AI tool called Africa Bias Buster. I'm gonna try and get to the chat box. I think what I can do is
Would also add it to the post email.
There we
yes,
go.
yes.
Fab. Thank you. So you just, and is it like a paid for service, or do you just?
It's so the Africa Bias Buster is not a survey, it's an AI tool. It scans your work for bias, context, stereotypes, then it gives you real life suggestions. So for example, how to better frame a story. So example, if language, let's say you're using language that ultimately makes the story stereotypical and
Yeah.
negative, it's going to give you suggestions on what you can say so that the messaging is still the same, but you're showing it from a lens of assets, not deficit.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. And do we have to pay for the service, or is it
No, 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 no. So all Africa No Filter tools, absolutely all of them are free to use.
Thank you very much.
So I'm gonna share the link in the chat box just now.
And thank you so much, Loretta, for coming up to speak to us and enlightening us that when we're saying our stories, you don't have to reinforce some certain stereotypes. So we'll finish now. Please, if you haven't filled in the survey, please do so. And we'll promise to send you some resources after the event. And thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for participating. And I hope we're able to learn a thing or two.